She leaned over the fence with a playful smile and whispered, "One knock, and you belong to me." I laughed it off, but deep down, I knew she wasn't entirely joking. The first time I truly noticed her, it wasn't because of anything grand. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the sky turns that soft amber before giving itself fully to night. I had stepped out to collect my mail, half distracted, when my eyes caught her across the low wooden fence. She was sitting on her porch, cradling a steaming mug between her hands. The ceramic made a faint clink as she set it down, and the sound seemed to carry through the warm hush of the evening. She had that unhurried grace people only develop with time, an ease in the way she leaned back, letting her hair fall over one shoulder as though the whole world was moving slower for her. I remember the way the loose strands caught the last bit of light, glinting gold against the fading sky. At first, I thought she hadn't noticed me. I busied myself with the mail, telling myself not to stare, not to get caught in the little details, the faint curve of a smile she wore even when her lips didn't move, or the steady calm she carried, like she knew more about the world than I ever would. But then her gaze lifted, as if she'd been waiting for me to look. Her eyes held mine a second too long. Not enough to call it bold, but long enough to make me shift where I stood. There was something in them, mischief, maybe, or simple curiosity, but it wasn't casual. It lingered. And for a fleeting moment, it felt as if the quiet street, the fading light, and the still air were conspiring to frame just the two of us. I managed an awkward smile, lifting the envelopes in my hand like proof of my purpose for being outside. She tilted her head slightly, as if amused by my nervousness, and then reached again for her cup. I could hear the faint scrape of ceramic against wood, smell the hint of coffee carried by the breeze. It was such an ordinary scene, her porch, my side of the fence, the rhythm of a neighborhood settling into evening, and yet it felt strangely charged, like stepping into a story I hadn't realized I was part of. I walked back toward my door, though my thoughts stayed behind with her. My heart wasn't racing exactly, but it wasn't steady either. Something about her composure unsettled me, made me feel both seen and slightly challenged. She was older, no doubt, but in that first glimpse, the years between us didn't feel like distance. They felt like gravity. That night, as I set the mail down and turned on the kitchen light, I caught myself glancing back through the window toward her porch. She was still there, mug in hand, the calm figure outlined against the evening. And even from across the fence, I could almost feel the weight of her gaze brushing against me, patient and unhurried, as if to say, "I saw you, too." The next encounter came on one of those afternoons where the air felt heavy, almost too still for comfort. I was dragging a bag of groceries from my car when I heard her voice carry over the fence, smooth, low, touched with a kind of playful ease that instantly made me look up. "Careful with that, you'll strain yourself," she called, a teasing lilt in her tone. I looked over to see her standing near the fence, garden gloves on, a pair of clippers in her hand. She'd clearly been trimming roses, but the way she leaned casually against the post, one hip tilted, it seemed less like she was gardening and more like she had been waiting for this exact moment. "I'll manage," I said, half smiling as I shifted the weight of the bag against my chest. Her eyes swept over me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me suddenly aware of myself, of my posture, of the fact that maybe I wasn't carrying the bag as smoothly as I thought. She smirked softly and stepped closer, resting her gloved hands on the top of the fence. "You know," she said, lowering her voice just enough that it felt private, "my door's always open. One knock, and you belong to me." The words landed like a spark dropped into dry grass, small, but impossible to ignore. For a heartbeat, I wasn't sure whether to laugh, to blush, or to pretend I hadn't heard. I did what any nervous young man might do, I chuckled, shifting the bag higher and hoping she didn't notice how my ears were burning. "Oh," I said, trying to sound casual, though the weight in her gaze made it difficult. "And what happens then?" She tilted her head, eyes glinting with that same mischief I'd caught a glimpse of days before. "That's for me to know," she replied smoothly, "and you to find out." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged, like the pause in a song before the chorus hits. My pulse drummed a little quicker than it should have. She didn't look away, and I had the odd sense she was measuring me, not with judgment, but with curiosity, as though deciding how much of her own game to reveal. Finally, she pulled off her gloves, tapped them lightly against the fence, and said with mock innocence, "Anyway, don't drop your eggs. That would be a tragedy." I laughed then, the sound breaking the tension, though inside, I was anything but relaxed. I mumbled something about hoping the groceries would survive and made my way inside. But even as I unpacked the bags, I could still hear her words replaying in my head, teasing, daring, tugging at me like a string tied loosely around my chest. One knock, and you belong to me. It was bold, yes, but it was also playful. And the way she after that afternoon, our paths seemed to cross more often. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe I had just started noticing her more. Either way, the small moments began to add up, threading themselves into something that didn't feel accidental. The first came when I spotted her struggling with grocery bags of her own. She was coming up the walkway to her porch, the paper handles threatening to tear. Without thinking, I jogged across the short patch of grass between our houses. "Here, let me," I offered, taking one of the heavier bags from her. She arched an eyebrow but allowed it, brushing a loose strand of hair back as she watched me carry the bag to her door. "Chivalry's not dead after all," she teased lightly. "Just on life support," I shot back, trying to mask the warmth creeping into my voice. Her laugh was low and unguarded, the kind of sound that settled in your chest and stayed there. I set the bag down just inside her doorway, the faint scent of her perfume, something floral, delicate but steady, drifting around me. For a moment, I lingered, caught between stepping back and wanting to say more. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. The next time, it was something smaller. She asked if I could water her plants while she was away for the weekend. I agreed, not thinking much of it, but when I stepped into her home for the first time, I felt the quiet weight of her space. Everything was neat but lived in, books stacked with care, a throw blanket draped over the arm of a chair, faint traces of her in every corner. I remember running my hand lightly across the spines of her books, noticing titles I didn't expect, classics mixed with poetry, travel journals tucked between novels. When she returned, she thanked me with a smile that felt warmer than necessary, her hand brushing against mine as she took back her house keys. It was the lightest touch, but it lingered like the echo of a whispered word. And then there were the casual run-ins. At the mailbox. Along the sidewalk. Each time, the conversation stretched a little longer than before. We'd start with weather, neighbors, errands, but somehow, we always ended somewhere more personal. Her favorite type of wine. The trip she once took but wanted to take again. The way she still woke early out of habit, even though no one was waiting for her to. It wasn't what we said as much as how it felt. The pauses grew heavier, the silences alive with things unsaid. Sometimes she would glance at me just as I glanced at her, and for the briefest second, it felt like we'd both been caught. I'd tell myself these were small encounters, no different from being polite with any neighbor. But late at night, lying awake, I couldn't stop replaying them, the faint brush of her fingers, the sound of her laugh. It was late one evening when I found myself on her porch again. I hadn't planned to stop by, just stepping outside for some air had somehow turned into walking across the short stretch between our houses. Her lights were on, a golden glow spilling gently through the kitchen window, and before I could second-guess myself, I gave a quiet knock. She opened the door with a surprised smile. "Out for a walk?" she asked, stepping aside without hesitation. I nodded, though I knew it wasn't the truth. She handed me a mug of tea without asking if I wanted one. Chamomile, I guessed, from the soft, floral steam curling upward. We sat at her kitchen table, a candle flickering between us, its flame swaying with each subtle movement. At first, the conversation was easy, books, neighbors, the way the weather had been holding steady lately. But somewhere in the quiet spaces between words, her tone shifted. She grew thoughtful, her eyes lingering on the cup in her hands instead of on me. "You know," she began softly, her voice carrying a note I hadn't heard before, "it's strange how a house can be full of things but still feel empty." I didn't interrupt. I just let her speak. "I used to fill the evenings with noise. Music, television, phone calls. Anything to make the silence less sharp." She gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh, shaking her head. "But after a while, I got tired of pretending. Now, sometimes I just sit here and listen to the quiet. Some nights it feels like a comfort. Other nights," she trailed off, her fingers tightening briefly around the warm porcelain of her cup. The pause that followed wasn't one of her playful silences. It was heavier, weighted with something unspoken. I leaned forward, resting my forearms lightly on the table. "That sounds lonely," I said quietly, not as an observation but as an offering, a way to let her know I'd heard the truth beneath her words. Her eyes lifted to mine then, and for the first time, the mischief I was used to seeing wasn't there. Instead, there was something gentler, something fragile. "It is," she admitted, almost in a whisper. "Sometimes." The honesty in her tone stirred something deep in me. I wanted to reach across the table, to do something, anything, to soften the weight she carried. And without overthinking, I let my hand slide just close enough to brush against hers where it rested near the candlelight. Her skin was warm, her haunted was one of those nights when time seemed to slip away unnoticed. I had stopped by under the excuse of returning a book she'd lent me, but she insisted I stay for a while. What was meant to be a quick visit stretched into hours, the two of us sitting in her living room with the soft glow of a lamp filling the space. Her home always felt warmer than mine, not because of the temperature, but because of the way it held her presence. The faint trace of her perfume lingered on the cushions, and the shelves behind us were lined with photographs and mementos, fragments of a life lived fully. I found myself studying them, curious about the stories they held. At some point, she pulled a photo album from the stack on the side table. "This," she said with a smile, "is a dangerous rabbit hole." She flipped it open, pages filled with sun-faded images of younger years, trips abroad, family gatherings, little moments captured long before I had ever been part of her world. She leaned closer to show me, the book balanced across both our laps. The first time her shoulder brushed against mine, I told myself it was nothing accidental. But then it happened again, her arm resting lightly against mine as she pointed out a picture, her hair falling forward so close I could catch the faint scent of it. I felt the warmth of her body through the thin barrier of fabric, and I realized she wasn't moving away. Neither was I. The clock ticked softly in the background, each second stretching longer than the last. My chest felt tight, not with discomfort but with awareness, of her closeness, of the quiet in the room, of the fact that the air itself seemed charged with something waiting to happen. "Here," she murmured, her voice low as she turned the page. Her hand brushed across mine as we steadied the album together. The touch was light, fleeting, but it sent a subtle shiver racing up my arm. I swallowed, forcing myself to focus on the photograph she was pointing at, her standing in front of a lighthouse, wind whipping her hair, laughter frozen in the frame. But the truth was, I could barely process the image. All I could feel was the weight of her presence pressed gently against me, the rise and fall of her breath so near my shoulder, the warmth of her knee brushing mine where we sat close on the couch. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just turned the pages slowly, letting the silence stretch, both pretending the album was our focus when, in reality, it was each other. At last, she closed the book, resting her palm flat on the cover. Her hand stayed there, still close to mine, her eyes meeting mine with a softness that carried more than words. We didn't cross any lines that night. For days after that evening on her couch, I carried the memory of her closeness like a secret stitched into my chest. The brush of her arm, the warmth of her presence, it should have been nothing, but it wasn't. It echoed in my mind during quiet hours, a soft reminder of how far we'd come from neighborly small talk. And yet, with every step forward, something inside me pulled back. Doubt. Hesitation. I told myself it was the age difference, that quiet, undeniable gap that hovered like a shadow in the background. What would people say? Friends, family, neighbors? Would they laugh? Would they judge? Would they whisper that I was chasing something I couldn't possibly understand? One evening, I found myself pacing in my own kitchen, staring out the window toward her warmly lit house. She was there, I knew, maybe reading, maybe making tea, maybe sitting in that same stillness she had once confessed felt too heavy at times. My chest ached with the pull to go to her, to knock on her door. But my feet stayed planted. The next day, she must have noticed my distance. When I stopped by to return her clippers, an excuse as thin as the air I breathed, she leaned casually against her doorway, studying me with those steady eyes. "You've gone quiet," she said softly. Not accusing. Not demanding. Just observing, the way she always did. I shrugged, fumbling for words. "Just, busy." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Busy, HM? Or careful?" The word struck deeper than I expected. Careful. That was exactly what I had been, tiptoeing around what I felt, afraid of stepping where the world might see. I shifted awkwardly, glancing past her shoulder instead of meeting her gaze. Her hand came to rest on the doorframe, fingers tracing lightly over the wood. "You don't have to explain," she said finally. "I know what people might think." I looked at her then, surprised at the quiet strength in her voice. "I've heard it before," she continued, softer now. "Too old. Too young. Too different. People like to measure love in numbers, in years, in what fits neatly into their picture of the world." She paused, drawing a breath. "But I don't live for their picture. I live for mine." The words should have eased me, but instead, they twisted tighter in my chest. Because I wanted to believe her. I wanted to step forward, to take her hand where it lingered against the doorframe. But fear is stubborn, and the night I finally found the courage, the world outside seemed impossibly still. The streets were empty, the air carrying that hushed weight just before midnight, when even the crickets fall quiet. From my window, her house glowed softly, a single lamp burning in the living room. It was the same warm light I had stared at countless times, wondering what it might feel like to stand inside it, to belong there. I must have paced my kitchen a dozen times, rehearsing reasons, excuses, anything that might justify the step I was about to take. But in the end, none of those words mattered. What mattered was the pull I couldn't resist any longer, the need to cross that short stretch of grass and close the space between us once and for all. My footsteps felt louder than they should as I walked toward her porch. Each one seemed to echo in my chest, heavy with a mix of fear and anticipation. When I reached her door, I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the wood. For a moment, I almost turned back. And then I remembered her voice, low and playful, weeks ago, "One knock, and you belong to me." So I knocked. It was soft, almost tentative, but it carried every ounce of intent I had been holding back. The door opened slowly, and there she was. Barefoot, wrapped in a loose sweater, her hair falling over her shoulders in waves that looked softer than any words could describe. She didn't look surprised. If anything, her smile curved as though she had been expecting me all along. "Took you long enough," she whispered, her tone light but her eyes warm, steady, knowing. I exhaled, the tension in my chest unraveling all at once. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she stepped aside, her hand brushing against mine as she gestured me in. That small touch was enough to steady me, to make me feel like I had finally done the right thing. The moment I crossed her threshold, I felt it, the shift. The invisible line we had both been walking around for weeks no longer existed. Inside, The world was hushed except for the faint hum of the lamp and the quiet rhythm of our breathing. We didn't rush into words. Instead, she closed the door gently behind me, then turned, her eyes searching mine with a softness that melted the last of my doubts. I felt her hand find my arm, resting there lightly, almost testing. I covered it with mine, pressing gently, letting her know I wasn't going anywhere. "I told you," she murmured, if this story touched you, don't forget to leave a like and share it with someone who loves slow-burn romance. And if you want more age-gap love stories told in this heartfelt way, make sure you subscribe, because every week, a new chapter of love is waiting for you, our lips curving into that familiar, teasing smile, though this time it was laced with something deeper. One knock. Her warmth seeped into me through that simple touch, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a visitor on her porch or a boy chasing something out of reach. I felt like I belonged, right there, with her. And as we stood in the quiet glow of her living room, I realized the story wasn't about the knock at all. It was about everything that had led me here, the glances, the silences, the vulnerability, the waiting. The knock was only the answer. The belonging had been there all along. Hesitation clung to me like a second skin. I managed only a faint smile, murmured a goodbye, and turned to leave. As I walked away, the ache in my chest grew heavier, sharper. Because even without her saying it outright, I had felt the truth in her eyes, the mix of courage and vulnerability, the quiet hope that I might choose her despite everything. And yet, that night, I left her standing in the doorway, her hand still resting against the wood, as if holding on to the space where I could have been. We had stepped closer to them than ever before. And as I walked home afterward, the phantom warmth of her shoulder against mine lingered long after the night air had cooled my skin. Still. She didn't pull away. She didn't laugh or tease. She just let the touch stay, her thumb shifting slightly against the side of my finger, as if acknowledging the quiet solidarity of the moment. We didn't need to fill the silence then. The faint tick of the clock on her wall, the gentle hiss of the candle's flame, the closeness of her hand beneath mine, they said more than words could. And for the first time, I saw her not just as the confident, teasing woman across the fence, but as someone quietly carrying the weight of nights that felt too long. Someone who, without meaning to, had let me in far closer than she'd intended. Quiet comfort of standing beside her as though we had nowhere else to be. And always, just beneath it all, her words from before tugged at me like a thread waiting to be pulled. "One knock, and you belong to me." Said it, with a knowing smile and just enough softness, made me realize she wasn't really asking for an answer. She was planting something. A thought. A temptation. And I knew, even as I tried to shrug it off, that part of me wanted to test it.